A couple set off on their anniversary hunting trip into the Michigan wilderness, but they never returned, vanishing without a trace into the vast Forsten. 2 years later, their dog suddenly shows up on the porch, injured, emaciated, carrying a secret. That would trigger a chain of events, exposing an unthinkable nightmare. Lisbeth's Spence pushed herself up from her knees, wincing as her arthritic joints protested the movement. The Michigan sun beat down on her weathered hands as she pulled another weed from around her tomato plants at 72 Vegerden. Work seemed to get harder each year, but she'd be damned if she'd let the weeds take over. Not after all through work she'd put into this patch of earth over the decades, just a few more. To herself, eyeing the row of vegetables that still needed attention, but the timer she'd set in the kitchen began, its insistent beeping reminding her of the pot roast. Simmering on the stove with a grunt of effort, she leveraged herself to her feet. One hand pressed against her lower back, the walk to the house seemed longer than it used to. Each step up the wooden porch stairs sent a twinge through her niched bin, putting off this garden work for weeks. But with Niels busy at his job and Dean, she stopped that thought before it could fully form. 2 years since. To the roast. When movement on the porch caught her eye, she turned, expecting maybe a raccoon or stray cat. The trowel clattered from her nerveless fingers there, lying on the worn wooden boards of her porch was a dog, but not just any dog. Even through the matted, filthy fur and the shocking thinness of his body, she recognized him instantly. Rufus, Dean's Irish wolfhound. Elizabeth stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest, where her heart had begun a wild, painful rhythm. No, she whispered, blinking hard. No, it can't be. The dog lifted his head weakly at the sound of her voice. One of his front legs was wrapped in what looked like a makeshift bandage, stained and filthy. His ribs showed starkly through his coat, and there was a raw infection on his forehead. But those eyes, those gentle brown eyes that had always looked at Dean with such devotion, they were unmistakably Rafusa. My God, Elizabeth gasped, her legs threatening to give out. She gripped the porch railing, unable to look away from the impossible sight before her. 2 years. The dog had been missing for 2 years along with Dean and Jocelyn. The search parties had found nothing, no bodies, no gear, no trace of them or Rufus in those vast Michigan woods. With shaking hands, she fumbled for her phone in her pocket, nearly dropping it twice before managing to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? This is Elizabeth Spence. She managed to get her voice barely above a whisper. I need officers at my house immediately. Dog, my son's dog just showed up. My son, who's been missing for 2 years. Ma'am, can you repeat that? Dean Spence's dog, she said more firmly, though her voice still shook. My son is D.H. and Dean Spence. He went missing 2 years ago with his wife, Jocelyn, while hunting their dog, just appeared on my porch. He singered badly. Please send someone now. Units are on their way, Mrs. Spence. Are you safe? Is anyone else there? Just me and the dog. He can barely move. Oh God, what does this mean? Where's my son? Stay on the line with me, ma'am. Officers will be there shortly. Elizabeth sank down onto the porch steps, keeping her eyes on Rufus. The dog's tail gave a weak thump against the boards, as if he recognized her too. She wanted Togo to him to comfort him, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. All she could do was stare and whisper, Where's Dean boy? My son. The wail of sirens grew louder, and within minutes two patrol cars pulled into her driveway. Officers Morrison and Bradley. She recognized them both. They'd been part of the initial search when Dean disappeared. Mrs. Spence, Officer Morrison, said gently, approaching slowly. His eyes widened when he saw the dog. Jesus, is that really? It's Rufus, Elizabeth confirmed, tears streaming down her face. Now it's Dean's dog. Officer Bradley was already on his radio calling for additional units, and a veterinarian, Marin, knelt beside the dog, careful not to startle him. Hey there, boy, you've had a rough time, haven't you? He looked up at Elizabeth. We need to get him medical attention immediately, and we'll need to take you to the station, Mrs. Spence. The detectives will want to speak with you right away. But what about searching if Rufus is alive? Maybe? Dean will handle everything, Morrison assured her. Let's focus on getting you and the dog somewhere safe first. More vehicles arrived, an animal control van with a veterinarian, 2 more patrol cars, and an unmarked detective's vehicle. Elizabeth watched in a daze as the vet, a young woman with gentle hands, carefully examined Rufus, where he lay. Severe malnutrition. Dehydration, the vet murmured. This wound on his head is infected. The leg, someone tried to bandage this, but it's been a while. We need to get him to the clinic immediately. In the back of Officer Morrison's patrol car heading to the station. Her mind raced with question show had Rufus survived. And Jocelyn, the familiar building of the police station, came into view, but it felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life. Unfold officers held doors for her, guided her to a comfortable interview room, not the stark interrogation rooms she'd seen on TV, but a softer space with padded chairs and a coffee maker in the corner. Mrs. Spence, I'm Detective Walsh, a woman in her 40s, introduced herself. I know this must be overwhelming, Ken. I get you some water, coffee. Where's the dog? Elizabeth asked. I need to know he's being taken care of. Dr. Hernandez from the emergency veterinary clinic is with him now. She'll update us as soon as she can right now. I need you to tell me exactly. Wuthapend. More people filed in. Detectives she recognized from Dean's department at the DEA uniformed. Officers who'd known her son. The small room grew crowded with concerned faces. Elizabeth recounted finding Rufus, her voice growing stertorous. She spoke. The detectives took notes, asked careful questions. When did Cellist see the dog before today? What was his condition then? Had she noticed anything unusual around her property? Recently, the bandage on his leg. Detective Walsh aid. Thoughtfully, that's not something a dog could do to himself. Someone helped him. Then someone seen him. Elizabeth said urgently. Someone knows something. We're already mobilizing search teams. Another detective assured her, we'll start from your property and work outward, follow any trail the dog might have left. Dr. Hernandez arrived, then still in her scrubs. He's stable, she announced, and Elizabeth sagged with relief. Sedated Forno, while we treat his wounds and run some tests. He's been through hell, sorry for the language, but he's a fighter, Summy, definitely. Provided medical care at some point, though not recently. That bandage is at least a few weeks old. When can I see him? Elizabeth asked. Let's give him a few hours to rest. I'll bring him to you as soon as he's ready. The vet paused. Mrs. Spence, that's one tough dog. Whatever happened out there, he fought to make it back. Room at the station had grown warm with so many bodies packed inside. Elizabeth sat at the center of it all, fielding questions from the growing group of officers and detectives. Word had spread quickly through the department. Dean Spence's dog had returned after 2 years. Mrs. Spence think carefully. Detective Walsh pressed gently. In the days before Dean and Joe's line went hunting, did he mention anything unusual? Any concerns about his work threats? He'd received. Elizabeth shook her head. Slowly, nothing. He was excited about the trip. They'd been planning it for months. Their anniversary hunting trip, he said. The woods up north were perfect. This time, a fair for deer. The door opened, and 3 more officers entered, including Lieutenant Marcus Hayes from the D. Elizabeth recognized him from department functions she'd attended with Dean. Elizabeth Hayes. You're going through this. We're going to do everything we can to find answers. He turned to the others. I've got to her tech team pulling all of Dean's case files from the 2 months before he disappeared. If someone targeted him, though, might be a connection. Another officer, one Elizabeth didn't recognize, stepped forward. He was younger, Mabe, mid-30s, with sharp blue eyes and close-cropped sandy hair. Mrs. Spence, I'm Professor Dmitry Volkov. I worked a few joint operations with Dean. He's a good man. The conversation continued, theorists flying back and forth. Elizabeth's head began to pound. She'd been at the station for over 3 hours now, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the initial shock was wearing off. Her arthritis was flaring badly, joints stiffening from sitting in the same position. I think Mrs. Spence has had enough. Now? Officer Vulov said suddenly, noticing her discomfort. Perhaps someone is hold. Take her home. She needs rest, and we need to coordinate the search teams anyway. Detective Walsh nodded. He's right. Elizabeth will continue working here. Is there someone we can call to stay with you? Me other son Niels, but he's at work in Detroit. It'll take him a few hours to get here. I can drive you home. Officer Vukov, make sure you're settled safely. This has been a tremendous shock. Elizabeth accepted gratefully. Her own car was still at home, and she wasn't sure she could manage the drive anyway, with her hands shaking as they prepared to leave. Dr. Hernandez called with an update. Rufus is stable, but still sedated. I want to monitor him for a few more hours. Make sure there are no complications from the treatment. Would it be all right if I brought him to your home this evening? I'd like to check his response when he wakes up fully, see how he does in familiar surroundings. Yes, please. Elizabeth said immediately. He should be home. The drive back to her house felt surreal. Officer Hulov kept up a gentle stream of conversation, asking about her garden, her years in the community. He seemed genuinely kind, helping her from the car when they arrived, making sure she had her keys. The search teams will be working through the night. He assured her as they walked to her door, every available officer is being Caladine. We'll find answers. Mrs. Spence, inside Elizabeth, sank into her favorite armchair, the one where she used to sit and watch Dean and Niels play as Boyce Officer Vulov. Checked the windows, the back door, making sure everything was secure. Would you like me to wait until your son arrives? He offered. No, you've been very kind. I'll be fine. She paused. Officer Vulov, do you really think could Dean still be alive? Something flickered across his face, concerned sympathy. It was gone before she could identify it. If anyone could survive out there, it would be Dean Henyu. Those woods better than most. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted them. Elizabeth looked out to see Niles's pickup truck pulling in at speed. Gravel spraying her younger son was out of the vehicle before it had fully stopped, rushing toward the house. Mom Niels burst through the door immediately, wrapping her in a careful hug. At 38, he was the opposite of Heisel's older brother in many ways. Where Dean was calculated and methodical, Niels was impulsive and emotional. I'm sorry. It was a nightmare, and my boss was being a complete... He noticed Officer Vulov and stopped. Sorry, I'm Niels Spence, Officer Dmitry Vulov. They shook hands. Ewas just making sure your mother got home safely. Is it true Rufus really came back? He's at the vet clinic. Elizabeth explained. Dr. Hernandez will bring him home soon. He's in bad shape but alive. Niels ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that Elizabeth's heart clenched. Just 2 years. How is that even possible? That's what we're trying to determine, Fischer, Volkov said. I should get back to the station, help coordinate the search efforts. He turned to Elizabeth. You have my card. Call if you need anything or remember any details that might help. Thank you for driving me home, Elizabeth said. You've been very kind. Vulov was just stepping off the porch when another vehicle turned into the driveway, a van with emergency veterinary devices emblazoned on the side. Dr. Hernandez was behind the wheel, perfecting. The vet called out, climbing from the van. He's starting to wake up. I'll need help getting him inside. Officer Vulov immediately turned back. I'll help. They opened the van's rear doors. Torivio Rufus on a special cushioned stretcher. The dog's eyes were open, but still glazed from sedation. His head lifted slightly at the sound of voices. Easy boy. Dr. Hernandez soothed. Let's get you. The transformation was instantaneous the moment Rufus' gaze landed on Officer Vulov. The dog exploded into motion. Despite his weakened statin, the sedation still in his system, he lunged upward, a deep growl rumbling from his chest, his lips pulled back showing teeth, and he barked with a ferocity that made everyone step back. Whoa, Niels exclaimed, moving protectively in front of. His mother Rufus continued to bark and snarl, his entire focus on Officer Vulov, who had taken several steps backward. Hands raised. It's okay. Vulov said, though. Elizabeth noticed he'd gone pale. I probably smelled like my canine unit Duke was in my patrol car. All morning dogs can be territorial about that, but Rufus wasn't backing down despite Dr. Hernandez's attempts to calm him. He continued to growl, hackles raised. Ice never leaving the officer. Maybe you should go, Niels suggested. We can handle it from here. Vulov nodded, attempting a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Yep, probably best. Duke's a German Shepherd. Very different energy from a wolfhound, Rufus probably thinks. I'm bringing compassion into his territory. He backed toward his patrol car. I'll check in tomorrow, make sure everything's okay. Only after the patrol car had pulled away did Rufus begin to calm, though he kept looking toward the road, a low rumble still in his throat that was strange. Dr. Hernandez mused, in my experience, dogs don't usually react that strongly to just a scent, especially not in Rufus's condition. Well, let's get him inside the vet, said Hughes Rast, and I want to monitor him for a few more hours. Mrs. Spence, do you still have his bed familiar? Items will help. Everything's just as they left it, Elizabeth said softly. I couldn't bear to change anything as they carefully carried Rufus into the house. Elizabeth couldn't shake the image of the dog's reaction to Officer Volkov in all the years Rufus had been part of their family. She'd never seen him act that aggressive toward anyone. Dr. Hernandez had left an hour ago, sat at his feet. That Rufus was stable enough to remain in Elizabeth's care. The dog now lay on his old bed in the corner of the living room, the same spot where he'd always kept watch when Dean and Jocelyn visited. His breathing was steady but labored, ribs visible with each rise and fall of his chest. Niels sat across from his mother at the kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee. Growing cold between them, the familiar ritual. Off-sharing coffee felt strange under these circumstances. The same table where they'd gathered for countless family meals, now heavy with unspoken fears. He loved that dog more than anything, Neil said, quietly watching Rufus sleep. Remember when he first brought him home? Joseline was so mad you didn't tell me he'd be the size of a small horse. Elizabeth managed a weak smile, but she fell in love with him just as fast. Used to sneak him treats when I thought. Dean wasn't looking. Dean always knew. Niels added, he'd pretend he didn't see. They lapsed into silence. Elizabeth's arthritis was acting up worse than usual stress, making her joints feel like they were full of ground glass. She rubbed her swollen ankles, absently mommed that reaction to the officer earlier. Neil started ICNO. It was strange. Dean always said Rufus could read people better than any person could remember that time. With the contractor who tried to overcharge them for the deck repair, Rufus wouldn't let Guy in the house, and Dean was right not to trust him. Elizabeth Ricalad found out later. He'd been scamming elderly homeowners all over the county. The phone rang, startling them. Both Elizabeth's heart jumped every call. Now carried the weight of possibility. Sheensward, with trembling fingers, Mrs. Spence, this is Detective Walsh. I wanted to give you an update on our search efforts. Yes, Elizabeth put the phone on speakerzo. Niels could hear. We've had teams in the forest since this afternoon. We were able to locate what we believe are Rufus tracks leading from the deeper woods toward populated areas. The canine units followed the trail for several miles, and Niels leaned forward. Walsh's voice was carefully neutral. The trail is old Mrs. Spence. Days, maybe weeks. It seems to meander. Significantly, the pattern you'd expect from an animal foraging, hunting, surviving on its own. We lost Etat several stream crossings, but someone bandaged his leg. Elizabeth protested someone help eat him. Yes, that's unusual. We're exploring the possibility that maybe a hunter or hiker came across him at some point and provided basic first aid, but honestly, Mrs. Spence, that bandage is crude. It could have been there for quite some time in this wilderness. It's not uncommon for people to help injured animals. They come across without reporting. What are you saying? Niels's voice had an edge to it, Detective. Walsh sighed audibly. Based on what we're seeing, the dog's condition, the meandering trail, the time frame, our working theory is that Rufus has been surviving in the wilderness for the past 2 years. Dogs are remarkably adaptable, especially a breed as hardy as an Irish wolfhound. He would have been able to hunt small game, find water sources. You think my son is dead? Elizabeth's words were flat, not a question, Mer Spence. I know this isn't what you want to hear, but 2 years in those woods with no confirmed sightings, no evidence of camps or shelters beyond what we found in the initial searches, the most likely scenario is that Dean and Joseline encountered some kind of accident, a fall perhaps, or wildlife that dog survived because he's a dog. They're built for survival in ways humans aren't. That's Neil snapped. My brother was DEA. He was trained for survival situations. He knew those woods like the back of his hand. I understand your frustration. You don't. You're writing them off, based on a few hours of searching, and some dog tracks, Mer. Spence, we're not writing anyone off. The search will continue. We'll have teams out there for days. Shelter, but I wanted to be honest with you about what we're finding so far. Elizabeth closed her eyes. Thank you for the update, Detective. We'll call immediately. If anything changes, try to get some rest. After she hung up, Niels slammed his fist on the table. They're giving up already. Just like 2 years ago they searched for months back. Then Elizabeth reminded him gently, not good enough, Dean. Wouldn't just die out there, and even if something happened there would be evidence. Bodies don't just disappear. Elizabeth couldn't finish the sentence. No, Neil stood abruptly. Don't accept that look at Rufus. He made it back. He found his way. Both looked at the sleeping dog. Even in rest, Rufus's face showed signs of ordeal scars that hadn't been there before. A chunk missing from one ear, fathomable wound on his head. Boy, Elizabeth whispered, where's my son? Rufus's eyes opened slightly at the sound of her voice. Tail, giving a single weak thump before he drifted back to sleep. Bandage means someone helped him. Neil said firmly, someone somewhere knows me. The police just need to look harder. Accidents happen. Niels even experienced people. Remember that park ranger last year who don't Neil spun to face her don't compare. There, since he was 12 and had never ever put Joseline in danger. I know that, do you? Because you're sitting there, listening to that detective's theories like they mean something, like Dean and Joseline. Just what fell off a cliff got eaten by bears. With no trace, Elizabeth flinched at the harsh Imajesty search teams. The search teams gave up after 3 months, just like they're regiving up now. Niels ran his hands through his hair in frustration. They see Rufus and think, oh, the dog survived in the wild for 2 years, the humans must be dead. But what about the bandage, Mom? What about the fact that Rufus made it home at all? He wouldn't leave Dean unless something forced him to. Still sleeping fitfully on his bed, you think Dean sent him for help? Niels's voice had dropped. I don't know what to think anymore. Elizabeth's shoulders sagged. I want to believe they're alive. God knows. I do, but 2 years. Niels, no ransom demands, no bodies, no camps, no signs. Maybe the police air right, maybe... Jaw said in a way that reminded Elizabeth painfully of his father. I'm not accepting that. Not without proof. He strode toward the hallway leading to the garage. Elizabeth heard him rummaging around, metal clanking against metal. What are you doing, Niels? Emerged, carrying his hunting rifle and Den's old camping pack. What I should have done better 2 years ago. I'm going back out there, Niels. It's getting dark. No, I've got lights and camping gear. He was already checking Therafil loading ammunition. Into his pockets I searched for weeks after they disappeared, but maybe I missed something. Maybe I missed something, Mabe. Things have changed if the motions they've already decided. Dean and Jocelyn are dead. He pulled out a tent sleeping bag, water purification. Tablets I haven't Elizabeth stood her arthritic knees. Protesting at least wait until morning, go with the search teams so they can tell me where I can and can't look. No thanks, he found Dean's GPS on it. Checked the batteries. I'll start where they went missing and work outward different patterns than last time if someone helped. Rufus, there might be cabins or camps. We missed. Please, I can't lose you two. He paused, then seeing the fear in his mother's eyes. Mom, I can't just sit here while they write Dean off. Elizabeth knew that determined look. She'd seen it in his father and Dean, and now in Niels' steer. Would be no talking him out of this. Be careful, she whispered. I will. He hogged her. Briefly then, headed for the door. Take care of Rufus, maybe. When he'll be able to show us something, the police said. The trail went cold. The police followed one trail. Rufus might have taken different routes over 2 years. There could be other signs. He shouldered the pack rifle in hand. I'll find something, Mom. Whatever happened out there, I'll find the truth. Elizabeth watched from the doorway as was its own kind of torturias. The truck's taillights disappeared into the gathering darkness. Elizabeth closed the door and returned to told the dog unnecessarily, just like you did, I suppose, Rufus went softly, his gaze moving to the door as if he too was watching. Niels let Elizabeth settled into her chair, one hand resting on the dog's head. Wait for secrets. Those woods held. She prayed they would finally give them up. Thous felt too quiet with now the window's dark mirrors reflecting the warm lamplight of the living room. Do you remember Altos? Sunday dinners, you under the table hoping for scraps. Joe's line always snuck you pieces of roast when she thought. I wasn't looking. Her voice caught. I miss them so much. I keep wondering, will I ever see my boy again? Will he walk through that door like you did? She knew she was being modeled, talking to a Daig about her fears, but who else was there? Niels was out in those dark wood shadows, and Hope, her arthritis, was too bad tonight to call her sister in Florida, holding the phone. That long will be agony, so she sat with Rufus, 2 survivors keeping vigil together. The police think they're gone. She whispered, they think you lived wild out this time, that Dean and Jocelyn had an accident, but you wouldn't leave him, would you not, unless you had 2 notenless, he told. You to go. A sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. Elizabeth's heart leaped. Niels must have changed. His mind decided to wait until morning. After all, she pushed herself up from the chair joints, protesting, and Officer Volkov, standing on her Porkus uniform, crisp, despite the late hour, he was holding what looked like a man aloof with her. Elizabeth opened the door partway. Officer Volkovitz, rather late. I apologize, Mrs. Spence, he said, and he did look genuinely apologetic. I know it's after 10, but I've been going through old case files at the station, cross-referencing some of Dean's work with missing persons reports from the last few years. I think I might have found something, a lead, possibly. There are some connections. I'd like to show you, get your input on. I was going to wait until morning, but I saw your lights were still on, and any new information, of course. Yes, cometh moment. She began opening the door wider. Rufus exploded into a frenzy of barking, despite his weakened state. He struggled to his feet, lips pulled back in a snarl, his focus laser-sharp on Officer Volkov. Rufus. No exclamation mark. Elizabeth turned back to the dog, shocked by the intensity of his reaction. But Rufus continued his aggressive display, actually trying to lunge forward. Despite his injuries, his barking was so loud it hurt Elizabeth's ears. "I'm so sorry. Gotten into him ever since he came back. He's been acting so strange." "It's all right," Vulov said, though Elizabeth noticed Heck kept his hand near his service weapon. "Trauma can change an animal's behavior significant. Me put him in his crate. Just give me a moment." It took considerable effort to get Rufus in. The large wire crate they kept in the corner of the living room, he fought her the whole way, something he'd never done before, and continued barking, even after she'd latched the door. "Hush now." "To help us." Cher turned to the front door, embarrassed and flustered. "I'm so sorry about that. Please come in. Would you like some coffee?" "Room, it must be difficult being here alone. With the very thing that's happened, Niels was here earlier, but he's gone to search the woods himself." To a low, continuous growls. "Yes, I suppose so now. You said you found some connections in old files." "I did some very interesting patterns that might explain." Elizabeth had just turned to ask him to have a seat at the kitchen table when she felt something soft press against her face. The sharp chemical smell hit her nostrils a split-second before she understood what was happening. A cloth over her mouth and nose, a chloroform. Her mind supplied uselessly as she tried to struggle. But Vulov was stronger, younger, and had the element. Off surprise, one arm wrapped around her waist, holding her against him, while the other kept the cloth firmly in place. Elizabeth's arthritic hands clawed weakly at his arm, but already the edges of her vision were going dark. "I'm sorry about this," she heard him say, his voice sounding very far away, "but your song made this necessary." Her legs gave out. The kitchen tilted sideways through the growing darkness. Could hear Rufus going absolutely wild in his crate, barking and snarling and throwing himself against the wire walls. "He tried to warn me." The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her completely was Rufus' desperate barking and the sound off. Her body hitting the kitchen floor. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it a pounding headache and the taste of chemicals. In her mouth, Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open to harsh fluorescent lighting and concrete. She was sitting on a cold floor, her back against something hard. When she tried Tomov, she realized her hands were bound behind her. "Ah, you're awake." Officer Vulov stood a few feet away, no longer the helpful, concerned officer from before. His uniform was gone, replaced by dark civilian clothes. The friendly mask had dropped entirely, revealing cold calculation in those blue eyes. "Why?" Elizabeth's. The voice came out as a croak. "Why are you doing this?" "Because your son couldn't leave well enough alone." Vulov replied matter-of-factly. "He had to play hero, had to send that damn dog for help." Elizabeth's mind struggled to process this. "You mean Dean is alive for now?" Volkov pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, though that may change depending on how cooperative everyone decides to be. Men entered through a metal door. Elizabeth hadn't noticed they were large, rough-looking, with the kind of face that had seen violence and hadn't minded it. They spoke rapidly to Vulov in what Elizabeth recognized as Russian, though she couldn't understand the words. Their tone was angry, aggressive. Volov responded in the same language, gesturing toward Elizabeth. One of the men spat on the floor and said something that sounded like a curse. "Get her up," Volov said in English. "Time for a The two men hauled Elizabeth to her feet, ignoring her gasp of pain as her arthritic joints protested. Her shoulders screamed as they half-dragged her through the warehouse. She tried to take in details: metal shelving, shipping containers, the smell of motor oil and rust. They were somewhere industrial. Butch had no idea where they passed through another door into a connected warehouse space. This one was darker withinly, a few overhead bulbs providing dim illumination. Volkov led them to what looked like a storage room that had been walled off with plywood, creating a crude cell. He produced a key and unlocked Apodelk on the door. "Your son has been our guest for quite some time, Mrs. Bensim. Sure, he'll be thrilled to see you." The door swung open and Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled. There, in the corner of the small room, was a figure that barely resembled her son Dean, while skeletal, his once strong frame reduced to skin. Stretched over bones, his hair was long and matted, his beard unkempt. He was secured to a support pole with heavy chains lying on a filthy, meretricious clothes, if they could still be called, that were rags, but it was high size that broke her heart. Those familiar brown eyes, so like his father's, no hollow and haunted. One of the criminals walked over and kicked the pole hard, the metallic clang echoing through the space. Dean jerked awake instinctively, trying to curl into himself before he saw who stood before him. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, disbelief and horror warring on his gaunt face. No. Dean Elizabeth tried to move toward him, but the men held her back. You see what happens when you make foolish decisions, one of the criminals said in heavily accented English. You send dog for help now. Your mother pays price to Dean, struggled against his chains. What little strength he had left going into the futile effort. Please don't hurt her. She has nothing to do with this. I'll tell you whatever you want, give you whatever information you already gave us. Everything useful, Volkov. Interrupted. Your mother is here because you couldn't just accept your situation. You had to try to be clever. Sending that mud away, please. Dean's voice broke. She's 72 years old. She has arthritis. She needs medication. You can't. We can do whatever want, the second criminal said. You should have thought of consequences before. Elizabeth finally found her voice. Dean, where's Joseline? The look that crossed her son's face told her everything. His eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, Mom, Dean whispered. I'm so sorry. This is all my fault. Touching, Vulov said dryly, but we don't have time for reunions. Kamithi dragged Elizabeth back out of the room. Dean's desperate pleas following them. Mom, I'm sorry. Don't hurt her, please. The heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. The criminals, again, in Russian gesturing and appearing to argue about something. Finally, Vulov nodded and turned to Elizabeth. You'll be kept separately. Can't have you two plotting together. They took her to another part of the warehouse, to a shipping container that had been modified into another makeshift soul. Inside was nothing but a pole fixed to the floor. Vulov produced zip ties and secured her to it, the position immediately sending fire through her arthritic joints. Please, Elizabeth Gaspetti, needs something to sit on properly, a mattress, a cushion, anything. My arthritis. Note my problem. Vulov said coldly. Your son shouldn't have sent the dog for help, Beef. He cared about your comfort. How long, Elizabeth? Managed. How long Havo had him? Volkov paused at the container door. 2 years, give or take. Your son has been very useful to our operations. Intelligence is quite valuable in certain circles. You forced him to give you information. Forced is such an ugly word. Let's say we provided proper motivation. First with his wife, then with the dog. He was much more cooperative. After we showed him what happens to those who resist the implications, hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Joseline was dead. They had tortured Dean for 2 years, used his loved ones against him. You're a police officer, she said, though it sounded foolish even to her. I'm a businessman, Vulov corrected. Benga police officer just provides excellent cover and access. Now, I have things totened to try to get comfortable, Mrs. Spence. Be here for a while, officer. Volkov had his hand on the container door. When he froze, the sound was unmistakable. Multiple vehicles approaching. Fast tires crunching on gravel. His hand flew to the radio on his belt. He spoke rapidly in Russian, his voice tight with urgency. The response that crackled back was panicked. The voice on the other end, shouting even without understanding the language. Elizabeth could hear the fear through thin walls of the container. She heard car doors slamming, many of them. Then, a voice she recognized, Detective Walsh on a megaphone. This is the police. We have the building surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Vulov spun back to Elizabeth, his face twisted with rage. He pulled out his service weapon, a Glock that looked impossibly large and black in the dim light. Your son brought this on you, he snarled, rushing back to her. All of this is his fault. He grabbed the zip tee, shouldering her to the pole, cutting them roughly with a knife. Elizabeth cried out as her arthritic wrists held in one position. Too Long screamed in protest, but Vulov didn't care. He hauled her to her feet, spun her around, and pressed the gun to her temple. Move, he ordered, dossing her as a shield as he pushed her toward the container door. Outside the container, the warehouse had erupted into chaos. Elizabeth could hear the Russians shouting to each other, the scrape of crates being pushed into defensive oppositions. Someone was yelling orders in accented English. Folk dragged her through the warehouse, keeping her body between him and the main entrance. Elizabeth's legs shook, her joints on fire, but the gun at her head kept her moving. This is your last warning, detective. Walsh's voice boomed through the megaphone. Release any hostages and surrender. Peacefully, the response was a burst of automatic weapons. Fire from somewhere near the main entrance. The warehouse erupted. Elizabeth heard glass-shattering bullets punching through the metal walls with sharp, pinging sounds. SWAT is breaching. Someone shouted. An explosion, a flashbang grenade. Elizabeth's ears. The deeper chatter of automatic rifles. Volkov cursed and pushed her Fester trying to navigate through the maze of containers and shelving they were passing under a wooden support beam when a stray bullet struck it, showering them both with splinters. Vulov instinctively ducked his grip on Elizabeth, loosening for just a moment. It was enough. Elizabeth wrenched herself sideways, her body protesting, but adrenaline giving her strength. She didn't know she still had. She stumbled, fell, and rolled behind a forklift. "Damn it," Vulov shouted. He looked between her and his escape route, made a split-second decision, and ran. Elizabeth lay gasping behind, the forklift splinters in her hair, her whole body shaking, the gunfire roars intensifying. She could hear officers shouting, "Move, move, move," and contact left. Dean. She had to get to Dean. Fighting through the pain, she began crawling across the concrete floor. Her knees screamed. Her hands were bleeding from the rough surface, but she kept going. The plywood-walled cell wasn't far. She could see it through. The chaos, that makeshift corner room where her son was chained, more gunfire erupted. Near what sounded like a back entrance, someone was screaming, and Russian glass crashed. A flashbang went off, somewhere to her right, the concussion making her ears ring worse. She reached the corner, crawled around it. The padlock was still off from when they'd brought her to see Dean. She pushed the door open. Dean wazed here, trying to sit up on his filthy mattress chains, clanking his hollow ice-widened. "Saw her mom get down," he whispered urgently. "Get behind." Something salad. Elizabeth crawled to him, staying low. More gunfire erupted closer now. She could hear the SWAT team's tactical commands. "Drop your weapons, hands behind your back." The commands were in English, no, directed at someone nearby. Russian voices yelled back defiantly. 3 quick gunshots, the controlled fire of trained police officers, then 2 more. Sumian started screaming in Russian, the sound full of pain and fear. Another shot cut it short, then suddenly silence, the kind that rings in your ears. After chaos, Elizabeth reached Dean, her arthritic joints burning from the crawl across concrete. He stretched his skeletal arms toward her as far as the chains would allow. "I'm sorry, Mom. This is my fault they took you, because she," Elizabeth said, taking his face in her hands, feeling the sharp bones under papery skin. "None of this is your fault." Footsteps approached fast, multiple sets, tactical boots on concrete. "Police, anyone in here?" The voice was American professional, but urgent here. Elizabeth called out, her voice cracking. "Where?" "Here, we need help." Multiple officers rushed in, weapons drawn, butt pointed low. They swept the room professionally, checking corners, and then behind them. Mom. Niels pushed past the officers, his hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. "Mom, oh God." He stopped short when he saw Dinklerly for the first time, his brother, the strong DE agent, who taught him to hunt, who'd always been larger than life, reduced to this skeletal figure, chained like an animal. "Jesus Christ." Niels breathed. "Dean, it's safe now." The lead SWAT officer said, already on his radio, "Suspects are down or in custody. We need bolt cutters in here." Another officer was shouting, "We need medics in here now. We have victims, 1 in critical condition." Niels dropped to his knees beside his brother, his face a mask of shock and rage. Dean managed a ghost of his old smile. "Hey, little brother, you look good. Don't joke, man." Niels' voice cracked. Not after he couldn't finish. Paramedics rushed in with their equipment and a stretcher. They went to work immediately, checking Dean's vitals, starting an IV. One of them produced bolt cutters and began working on the chains as they freed him from the pole. Dean gripped Elizabeth's hand with what little strength he had, his eyes filled with tears. "They killed Jocelyn, Mom, 14 months ago." Ya's voice broke. "She tried to escape, and they shot her maid." Miwach said, "It was my fault for not cooperating fast enough." Elizabeth held his hand tighter, her own tears flowing freely. Niels made a sound like a wounded animal. "We've got to move him." One of the paramedics said he needs immediate medical attention. They so carefully lifted Dean onto the stretcher, he weighed almost nothing. Elizabeth struggled to her feet, Niels immediately there to support her. Together, they followed the stretcher out of that hellish room. The warehouse was a war zone. Bullet holes pocked through holes, spent shell casings littered the floor. SWAT officers were everywhere, some still clearing rooms, others standing guard over suspects. They emerged into the night air. When had it become night? How long had she been in that container? And Elizabeth gasped at the scene. Police vehicles everywhere, their lights painting everything in reds and blues. Ambulances waiting. 3 Russians were on their knees, hands zip-tied behind their backs. Officers standing guard. Bodies lay under white sheets, blood seeping through, and there in the back, OFO patrol car sat Officer Dmitry Volkov. His face was bloodied, He'd been tackle-lettering his escape attempt, Elizabeth would later learn. He stared straight ahead, not meeting. "Anyone's eyes, ma'am. We need to check you out, too," a paramedic said, approaching Elizabeth. Booch couldn't look away from Dean as they loaded him into the ambulance to Yorkshire. Son had been held in that warehouse for 2 years, just miles from home. The nightmares were over, but the healing had just begun. Elizabeth stood at the glass window of the ICU. Her palm pressed against the cool surface. She still couldn't reconcile the skeletal figure in the hospital bed with her son Dean Holloway's been. Strong, solid 6 feet of trained muscle and confidence. The thing laying in that bed looked like a concentration camp survivor, Mrs. Spence. Dr. Kumar approached high-expression grave. "I wanted to update you on your son's condition," Niels joined them, his arm around his mother's shoulders. They'd both been checked and released. Elizabeth's injuries were menorrho. Her arthritis was flaring terribly from the stress and abuse. He's severely malnourished. Dr. Kumar began consulting his tablet. His body weight is approximately 60% of what it should be. "We're seeing signs of refeeding syndrome, so we have to be very careful with nutrition. Severe dehydration has damaged his kidneys. We're monitoring that closely, will he?" Elizabeth couldn't finish. "Yesbet. We're seeing infected wounds, particularly on his wrists and ankles from the chains. Muscle atrophy is severe then if he recovers. He'll need months of physical therapy to walk properly again." Elizabeth's joints screamed as she shifted position. She ignored them. Her pain was nothing compared to what Dean had endured. "There are some people here who need to speak with him." Dr. Kumar Adedra reluctantly, "FBI, they say it's urgent." Through the glass, Elizabeth watched 2 agents in dark suits enter Dean's room. They were gentle, professional, but she could see the urgency in their movements. Whatever Dean knew, it was important. She and Niels were allowed in to support him during the interview. Dean's voice was barely a whisper, and he had to rest frequently, but his mind was sharp. The details he revealed made Elizabeth's blood run cold. The warehouse was a hub, Dean rasped. Smuggling operation, drugs, weapons. People sometimes route from Canada using back roads. Private property. They had had Border Patrol on payroll. How many officers were involved? Agent Martinez asked, recording everything. Saw maybe 12 different ones over 2 years. Volkov was the main contact, but there were more. They talked about others. Dean closed his eyes, concentrating. "Badge numbers I memorized. Badge number Schwen. I could see them." He recited a series of numbers. Agent Martin Mezer was already on the phone relaying the information. The Agent Martinez prompted gently. "Cartel money. Mexican cartel partnered with Russian mob. Millions invested." They needed intel patrol schedules, planned raid switch routes. We were watching. Dean's skeletal hand-clenched eye held out. "For 3 months, then they brought Jocelyn to my cell, said they'd hurt her if I didn't cooperate." Elizabeth squeezed his other hand, feeling the bones through papery skin. "I gave them outdated intel at first, stuff that wouldn't matter, but they figured it out." Tears leaked from Dean's sunken eyes. 14 months in. Jocelyn fought back, grabbed a gun from one of them during feeding, almost made it to the door. His foes broke. Niels made a sound of pure rage. "They shot her in front of me. Cadet was my fault. Said if I just cooperated." Dean couldn't continue for a moment after that. "They used Rofus. Every time I hesitated, every time I tried to give them false information, they'd hurt him." Burns, cuts, beatings, that wound on his head. "That was from 2 weeks ago, when Itri to refuse again, but you got him out," Agent Martinez said. "Took me months to work at free opening was too small for me, but Rufus could squeeze through ICNU. He'd find his way home. He knows every trail between here and Mom's house." "How did you convince them to bring the dog to you?" "Told them I was dying, that I'd give them everything, safe house locations, undercover agent identities, but only if I could say goodbye to my dog first. They believed me because I looked dead already." A ghost of a smile. Vulavela Wasandra stayed. "How smart." Rufus is. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, Dean providing every detail. He could remember license plates, voice names mentioned in passing. The FBI agents looked grimmer with each revelation. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a massive corruption case that reached into multiple law enforcement agencies. Finally, Dr. Kumar intervened. Hannity's to rest as the agents left. One turned back. "Mr. Spence, we've already arrested 8 officers based on the raid. Your information will help us get the rest. You've saved a lot of lives." Dean closed his eyes. Couldn't save the one that mattered most. Knock at the door interrupted. The heavy silence. Dr. Hernandez, the veterinarian, stood there with a familiar figure. I got special permission, she said softly. Someone wanted to see his dad. Rufus limped into the room, his tail wagging, despite his injuries. The dog, who'd been too weak to stand properly just hours ago, had found new strength. He approached the bed carefully, as if understanding how fragile Dean was. Hey boy, Dean whispered. Dean whispered. Dean breathed. Such a good boy. You did it, Yoggett. Help. The dog carefully placed one paw on the bed. Maintaining contact, Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway one more time. Mrs. Spence, I thought you should know we've found... Nodded, unable to speak, just as was coming, but it couldn't bring back Joe's line or undo 2 years of torturous. The room cleared, leaving just family. Niels moved closer to his brother's bed. Dad would be proud, he said quietly. You never gave up. You survived, and Yoggett Rufus home. Dean's eyes found his brother. You for that, Elizabeth thought of Joe's line, vibrant laughing. Came again, silent, and painfully memorized everything, Dean whispered, his energy fading. Every face, every Nemivri, Elizabeth said, stroking his forehead around the IVs and monitors. Just rest. Dr. Kumar returned. He needs to sleep. You can stay, but please let him rest. The family settled in for their vigil. Niels in an uncomfortable chair, Elizabeth in a recliner a nurse had brought for her arthritic joints. Rufus curled on a blanket on the floor, positioned where he could see Deanne refusing to leave his post. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors and Dean's breathing. Elizabeth settled back, prepared for the long vigil ahead. Her son was home, damaged, grieving. A small victory, a defiance of those who'd tried to break him. He'd survived. They'd survived.